or John Cleese. I saw that they had all three of those had recently read out a book onto tape. It's the authentic voice of that person that you'll recognise, and when they tell an anecdote, it's somehow, I don't know, I think it's got a bit more power if it comes from the lips of the person who actually shaped those words. That person will, I imagine, know exactly how to read those words out.
Audible.
Anyway, if you click the link which is appearing on your screen now, which is www.audible.com/LindyBeige, then you'll be able to go to a page on the site where you will find an offer of 1 free month subscription, and you'll get 1 free book that you can keep forever. It's yours. You don't have to listen to it during that month. It's yours to keep forever, honestly. And obviously what they want is that they want you to subscribe and keep downloading more books. But if you feel that after a month, no, you've seen and heard enough, well, then you can just unsubscribe and you won't owe them a bean. And there's a link in the description which you can click on as well, which is slightly easier than typing in this address. So there you go.
Audible.
Now, I was talking about tanks, if you remember. And something that I've not discussed is how tanks move around. Now, at the moment, the standard tank moves around on tracks, and that might not change because tracks work really well. They spread the load very well. They've got extremely good grip, and they transfer the power of an engine very efficiently. They are like laying your own little road, so they're good for cross-country. They're good for soft ground and hard ground. Tracks are really good. And though it's possible that in the future they will develop legs for walking tanks, that they've already got to robots that can walk, the dog-sized and horse-sized, but the amount of energy it takes to walk something that's really big. Now, we're talking about tanks, remember, so we're assuming that it's a tank as we imagine a tank, a really heavily armoured thing, so it's going to weigh an awful lot. And an awfully heavy thing that's rolling along on wheels can be moved much more easily than something that has to be moved on legs. You know this, don't you? If you've ever pedalled a bicycle, it's a lot less tiring than, say, running. And so the engine required of a really big tank and the amount of fuel it would go through if you want to put it on legs, at the moment seems to rule legs out. But who knows? Again, in the future, new technologies might come in and legs might become feasible. Now, there are two other things I wanted to make, points I wanted to make about the movement of sci-fi tanks. The first is to do with what's known as steering ratio. Now, I read a book on tank design some while ago, and it pointed out that there's actually a very narrow range of ratios between the distance between the tracks and the length of the track in contact with the ground that actually work. Other tanks that break these rules, that go outside this range of ratios, have been tried and they have been shown not to work. So, in short, this is the shortest, fattest tank that you can get away with, whereas this is the longest, thinnest tank that you can get away with. You've got a bit of wiggle room because, of course, the length of these tracks is the length in contact with the ground, so you can have a bit of overhang at the front and back, but you can't have too much. Now, if you imagine an extremely long, thin tank with tracks that are quite close together, that will be really good at going straight forwards. It'll be able to go straight forwards in a very stable manner. But as soon as it tries to, say, turn left, this side, the tracks on this side, will accelerate and will try to, oh my goodness, the friction, the sideways friction of trying to get these tracks to turn like that is absolutely horrendous. So it handles extremely badly, puts a huge amount of strain on the tracks and wheels, and quite often, ping, something somewhere gives, and you come to an embarrassing halt. So obviously you make your tank a bit stubbier and wider, and hey, why don't you make it really stubby and really wide, so you've got quite short tracks either side of you. Well, then you've got the opposite problem. You have a really unstable, whoa tank that every bump it goes over throws the whole tank out horrendously, and it's really difficult to keep stable that way. People have tried, and they have found that 1.5 to 1.8 to 1, that's the range you've got to work with. And if you look at a lot of sci-fi tank designs that I've seen in classic games, like, for instance, Steve Jackson's Ogre, which is it's a good game. Hey, I'd recommend it as a game, but when you look at some of their pictures of tank designs for the future, you'll notice that they're breaking this ratio rule. And I've seen so many tanks that when I look at these sci-fi tanks, immediately I get the feeling of wrongness about them. That one's too long and thin, or this one's just too short and fat. It wouldn't work. Though an interesting thing I've noticed with a lot of these futuristic designs, including some of the ogre tank designs, is they've split the tank into two. Although actually I think they've split them into two in a way which still wouldn't work. But there's an interesting idea, and with slightly different ratios and a different central hinging mechanism, perhaps that could be got to work. It still wouldn't be a wonderfully manoeuvrable tank though. So there's another possibility, the hover tank. Oh yes, we've all designed a hover tank, haven't we, in our sketchbooks at school during a particularly boring maths exam or lesson. Don't sketch during exams. Take exams seriously, kids. Education. Anyway. There are problems here too. Now, some of you have perhaps lived all the way through the James Bond film Die Another Day, in which case, well done. And you may remember that there's a sequence near the beginning of that, a big action opening sequence, in which our hero is chased in a military armoured hovercraft by lots of other military armoured hovercrafts. The plan, you see, the dastardly North Koreans have decided that they will be able to hover over the huge minefield separating North and South Korea harmlessly, because they have hover tanks, you see, and these will pass harmlessly over the mines, which of course are all designed to be set off by heavy tanks and other vehicles going across them. But these hover things will just hover over, hardly even touching the ground, won't set off any of the mines, and no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. Think about it. The mine is set off if force is pressed down into the ground, which triggers the mine. Okay, so how is the hovercraft actually lifting off the ground? It's exerting downward force, isn't it? An awful lot of downward force. Now, I grant you that the area that force is being pressed down over is larger perhaps than a tracked vehicle, but it's still got to be, if you've got a very large armoured hovercraft full of men and weapons and so forth, it's still going to be very heavy, and it's going to be exerting a lot of downward pressure on the ground. So it was still going to set off mines. Plus, even if those mines, some of them have been calibrated for the tracks of a heavy tank, you lay a mixed minefield. There will be mines that are calibrated to be triggered by lighter vehicles, by infantry and personnel. So, infantry is personnel. But anyway, so that wouldn't work. That was a silly idea. And the hover tank has a number of other problems. For instance, one of the principal reasons that the tank was designed in the first place was to cross trenches. Now, if you're on a nice flat surface, like for instance a calm sea, hovercraft work really well. They're very efficient, and they glide with very low friction, whee, across the surface of the sea. But if you're trying to cross a trench, the downward air goes into the trench, then sideways and off. It's not supporting you anymore. So as you were going over a trench, you would just go and you wouldn't get over a trench. So one trench would protect South Korea from North Korea in combination with these minefields. So yes, they don't cross mines and they don't cross trenches. So that's two really big disadvantages. They're also pretty rubbish at going up, a parapet. If there's a low wall or something that you want to go over, a hovercraft is not going to do that terribly well. Now there are, of course, sci-fi hover tanks which don't have a bag of air with skirts which is holding in this high pressure area of air underneath the tank which is holding it up, and instead they have other things, sort of weird glowing things, repulsors or whatever you want to call them, just that are somehow repulsing the ground and causing the tank to hover in a sci-fi way. Well, great, but presumably they're still using ground effect. Imagine you're in a helicopter. If you're flying in the air, you're just pushing air downwards beneath you, and that's what keeps you going up. But as you come down to the ground, that air is now being pushed into the ground, and it finds it quite difficult to get out of the way because the ground is really solid. And that means that you get what's called ground effect. You actually get more lift when you're very close to the ground. So that's one of the things which makes landing a helicopter a little bit more challenging, because you get nice and low, you're descending at just the rate you want, and then suddenly you're not descending anymore because the ground effect kicks in. Well, if the ground effect is required to hold the tank off the deck, then again you've got problems doing things like going over trenches. But if you don't need the ground effect to suspend the tank, if you're able to push downwards with these repulsors or whatever they are with enough force so that you can actually rise upwards, well, then what you've got isn't really a tank, it's an aircraft. You're flying. So yes, a heavily armoured aircraft is what you've got then, with a turret which will sort of unbalance it a bit. It's not a terribly... Why not just have an aircraft? I'd have an aircraft. If you can generate that amount of repulsive power so that you can... Repulsive power, I like the idea of that. Ooh, that's repulsive power. That you can fly through the air in a very heavily armoured vehicle, well, do that then instead. That'll probably be better. So I'm not convinced by the hover tank. And when you watch the James Bond movie, you may notice that this movie does actually bring to our attention some other drawbacks of the hovercraft as a tank. You see, if in the future we still live in a world which has things like mass and momentum in it, and I think that's likely to be the case, well, the hovercraft, when it's going forwards that way really fast, and isn't it great that they can go so fast, because speed's very useful for a tank. You may be interested to learn that in Europe the tank target is typically exposed to fire for between 15 and 25 seconds. That's how long you've got to see it, acquire it, load in the right ammunition, get off an accurate shot against it. So obviously if it can go faster, it will be exposed for a shorter amount of time. It's going to be more difficult to hit. So speed is great. So there you are zooming along in your hover tank, but you're a tank still. You've got lots of armour, so that means you've got lots of mass. So you then turn your hover tank and you try to go that way, but you've still got an awful lot of momentum that way. And rather amusingly, in the film, you'll notice that whenever a hovercraft tries to make a sudden turn, the editor always cuts at that point. And then in the later shots that we see in the sequence, it's now turned the corner and is going off in the new desired direction. It's almost as though what actually happened is it went that way, turned, and then carried on going that way. They said cut, and then eventually brought it to a halt, and then brought it back, and then okay, forwards, and okay, and turn over, next shot, great. And then they cut the two shots together. I think that might have happened. So there you go, a few thoughts about sci-fi tanks. I've talked about sights, I've talked about guns, I've talked about movement, and so there you go, tanks. They're great.
LindyBeige!
In a recent video, In this video, which has been sponsored by the Great Courses Plus, but more of that later, I'm going to be talking about the effectiveness, or perhaps the ineffectiveness, of bombardment upon the enemy with bombs and artillery and all that sort of stuff in modern warfare. Now, there was the infamous Day of the Typhoon. Yes, the Day of the Typhoon. Doesn't that sound good? On this day, the British were advancing against the Germans, but the Germans were trying to counterattack and they were sending tanks to the front. The British were going forwards from the Normandy area and they ruled the skies. Yes, the British had achieved almost total air superiority, and there were hundreds of sorties were flown with the Typhoon ground attack planes, and these had cannons and machine guns and so forth, but they also had rockets. 8 rockets, 4 on each wing. Now, these are 8-inch rockets. So that's 8 times 8 inch. A cruiser at the time typically had about 8 8-inch guns. So one of these Typhoons coming at you and shooting all its rockets at you was equivalent to being on the receiving end of a broadside from a cruiser. So pretty terrifying, I think you'd agree. And the Day of the Typhoon went down in history as the time when 89 kills were racked up to the RAF, or at least 89 kills were claimed by the RAF. But then later, when inspectors on the ground went forward over the area that had been fought over and looked for these 89 wrecks that had been blasted to smithereens by rockets, that's not actually what they found. They found 10 that they were pretty confident had been knocked out by rockets. There were marks of rocket hits on them, nothing else that would explain that the vehicle had been knocked out. So yes, okay, so 10 that could be confidently clocked up to rocket hits. Perhaps others had been hit by rockets but not knocked out or had been towed away, so those didn't get recorded. But 10 definite kills, and another 10 which it seemed had been abandoned whilst being rocketed. So there were rocket hits all around. The vehicle didn't seem to be really knocked out exactly, but clearly it was abandoned. The crew had scarpered. So that leaves an awful lot of gap to bring it up to 89. But it seems that a very large number of Germans had just decided to be somewhere else in their tanks. You can imagine, can't you? You're in a German tank, you've got the radio on in your headphones, and you hear, oh, one of my colleagues has just been knocked out. Oh, and another. And here come Typhoons. And ooh, they fly over the top. And what do? You can just hope that they miss you, and then you've lost contact with another load of your guys, and you just think, I don't want to be here. Pretty quickly the Germans twigged that it was the tanks that the RAF were targeting. So if you were in a tank and a load of Typhoons turned up, suddenly you really didn't want to be there anymore, so you would hide or run away. And as long as the Germans are busy hiding and running away in their tanks, then they're not busy fighting at the front in their tanks. So the job's being done. You are effectively depriving the Germans of tank support, even if you're not actually hitting the tanks. Now, how often did they hit the tanks? Well, it seems that something like 1 rocket in 100 might actually hit a tank, and that if the rockets were fired competently and properly, then they were landing within about 150 yards of the target. The trouble is that tanks, though terribly large, are not 150 yards wide. And if you think of a circle of 150 yards in diameter, there are an awful lot of places in that circle you can put a tank where a rocket is not going to hit it. And if you're in a tank, of course, and a rocket misses even quite nearby, you're probably fine. You're in an armoured box. So if you're a crewman in a tank, you might think, well, I'll just stay in this armoured box. Yeah, but if 3 Typhoons come at you, each with 8 rockets, that's roughly a 22% chance of being hit. It's coming on for 1 in 4. Are those odds that you fancy? 1 in 4 chance if you just sit in your iron box that you're going to be blown up? No, maybe you'd rather be somewhere else. So you might abandon and leg it, or you might just drive your tank somewhere else. So the Day of the Typhoon was not anything like as effective in the number of tanks that were actually killed by rockets, and yet it seems that it was still fairly effective. And also it's good for morale too when you see loads of Typhoons swirling around overhead and not so many German tanks around. So you think, yeah, if you're a British infantryman going forward, this seems like a fairly good day. The Day of the Typhoon, even though not many of those rockets actually hit. And the same could be said of an awful lot of bombardment. For instance, there was, at the same stage in the war, there was a 500-yard long viaduct that became a priority target for the RAF, and they attacked it over and over again and again afterwards when inspectors went to actually see how many bombs had hit it, and they knew how many bombs had been dropped on it. They found out that 1 in 82 bombs had actually hit the target. So you might think, well, these pilots are a bit rubbish. I mean, it's a 500-yard long target. How difficult can it be? Don't they practice? Well, yes, they did practice, and I'm sure they were a great deal more accurate when they weren't being shot at. Now let's imagine that the viaduct is straight. So there's a pretty obvious line along which you would want to fly. You would want to fly directly in line with the viaduct, wouldn't you? So that your left and right is pretty much catered for, and if you're a little bit short or long, it's not going to matter. You can hit the viaduct anyway because it's 500 yards long. Yeah, but any German gunner with a machine gun is going to work that out unless he's an idiot. So all he has to do is aim a stream of bullets along that line straight over the viaduct, and anyone trying to fly along that line is going to fly through that stream of bullets. So when you are being shot at and you're jinking and swerving and around all over the place trying to avoid being hit, you're going to end up doing a bombing run that's a sort of swooping thing like that at an awkward angle, and yep, only 1 in 82 bombs will actually hit the target. But you might think, well, with artillery, surely it's much better with artillery because they're set up and they've got charts and tables and they can fire shell after shell and walk things onto the target with forward observers, and it's better, right? Yeah, but it might surprise you just how inaccurate an awful lot of artillery was. Now, in an early attack against Germany in 1945, a fairly studied attack, it was found that fewer than 5% of the shells fired landed within 50 yards of a point target. By point target, I mean it's not an area they're trying to hit. It's not a big barrage of an area. They're trying to hit a particular gun emplacement or something. So against a point target, only 5% were getting within 50 yards. When the Canadians were attacking, Boulogne, they fired, well, they managed to, I don't know how many they fired actually, but they managed to land 6,000 shells within 150 yards of a German AA battery that had 8 guns firing away. So that's 6,000 artillery shells landing within roughly the accuracy of a properly fired rocket from a Typhoon. They managed to knock out just 2 of those anti-aircraft guns, or putting it another way, they managed to knock out 2 of the anti-aircraft guns. But here's the, you might say, surprising thing. The other 6 carried on firing. Despite 2 of them being knocked out and this tremendous barrage of thousands of shells coming at them, the other 6 were able somehow to carry on firing. So, in 1945, when the British were going forward, that same study I mentioned before calculated that they fired 500,000 shells in one operation and killed 60 of the enemy. 500,000 shells to kill just 60 of the enemy. It's beginning to look, isn't it, as though this bombardment stuff is just useless. It's just rubbish. It doesn't kill anyone. Well, I put it to you that actually killing people should not be the object. If you think that something has failed because it didn't hit, because it didn't kill, then I think you're missing the point. The object surely is not to kill people. In fact, wouldn't it be nice if we could avoid killing people? The object is to win the war. And you win wars not by killing absolutely everyone on the other side, particularly something like World War II. Just think of the scale. What you do is you persuade the enemy to stop fighting. So how do you persuade the enemy to stop fighting? Well, you've got to get him to surrender. So what you would like then is some sort of contagious behavior. Because though it is occasionally the case that commanders from on high order very large numbers of men to surrender all at once. So for instance, the obvious example, the fall of Singapore. British High Command ordered 60,000 British to surrender, and they obeyed orders. And they surrendered, the biggest defeat for the British of all time. But usually in a war, it's small numbers, perhaps 1 platoon, a company at most, taking prisoners of small numbers of the enemy. And so you've got to find out some localized way of getting guys to surrender, because surrendering is contagious, whereas death is not contagious. If I'm here in a position with a load of my men in my unit, and I see over there, forward and left of us, there's another lot of us, and they get attacked by the enemy and they are all killed, I don't think to myself, yeah, dying, yeah, that's a good idea, should we give that a go? It's not a contagious behavior. People don't die because other people have died. But if I see that lot surrender and they show white flags, and then the enemy stops shooting at them, and then there's a parley and they're led away and everything seems to be quite amicable and no one is, at least while I'm watching, mistreated, and I think, well, phew, that all seemed to be quite orderly. So actually these guys are disciplined enough to accept a surrender and will stop shooting if you offer surrender. And okay, so now this seems like a viable behavior. Maybe we should surrender. I mean, there are an awful lot of them, and so we're probably likely to lose, and it seems that they will give us an opportunity to surrender. So if that opportunity is offered to us, then maybe we should take it as well. Surrendering is a possibly contagious behavior, and if you can get more and more guys to surrender, then it snowballs, and then eventually you've won the war. Hooray! So if you can persuade people to surrender rather than killing them, it's actually better. So maybe we should look more at the psychological effects of bombardment. You see, it wasn't until about World War One that the military finally twigged that the main effect of bombardments is psychological. It was discovered, for instance, that if you could kill 5% of the opposition, then the fighting effectiveness of the opposition would be halved. Okay, so if there are 1,000 troops over there and you kill 50 of them, then the remaining troops will fight as effectively as just 500, not 950. And if you can kill 10% of them, then their fighting effectiveness goes down to approaching zero. Of course, you can never guarantee this, but in the main, it goes down to approaching zero. Now, I strongly suspect that that's not because of the actual killing. I don't think it's because you've killed 1/10 of them that the others are incapable of carrying on fighting. I think it's got far more to do with what you have to do in order to kill 10% of them is what renders the other 90% incapable, or at least unwilling, to resist you. So by the time you've hit them with so much ordnance, so many loud bangs, so many flying splinters of death all over the place, enough to kill 10% of them, then the effect of all that renders the other 90%, stuff it, I'm not going to fight, I've had enough of this. So how can we measure fear then? Well, unfortunately, there is no reliable way of measuring it. You could say, oh, well, surely there are correlates of it. What about heart rate? Yeah, well, heart rate goes up and down all over the shop. You can't keep very high heart rates going for long periods of time, such as the length of time that modern battles tend to last. One man's heart rate may go up and down in quite a different pattern to another's. And are you really going to try to measure loads of people's heart rates while there's a war on? It has to be real fear, right? So it has to be a real war. That experiment just doesn't work. And it doesn't tell you anything what you want to know. Some men will be absolutely terrified, but they'll still fight effectively. They feel the fear, but fight anyway. So it doesn't actually tell you very much about how they'll behave as soldiers either. So it's not that useful. Some men will run, some will stand and fight, and others will just cower in terror. Now, in 1917, a study was done about the danger to men in bombardments, and it was found that obviously these figures are very convenient and round, but it was found that if you are standing upright, you are 10 times more likely to become a casualty if you're in a bombardment than if you're lying on the ground. Now, one of the things you have to do in order to run is stand up. So you could try to run through a barrage in order to escape with your life, or you could just lie down. And statistically, you're much more likely to live if you just lie down. But of course, then you don't feel as though you're in control. You just have to lie there and hope that you don't get hit. But statistically, yeah, just lie down. It's better. But if you can get into a trench, in a trench, you're 100 times safer. So if you're immediately next to a trench, just jump into the trench. But if you're in a bunker, you're 1,000 times safer. So yes, if you are in a trench, then it is probably worth moving, but only to go deeper underground into the bunker. But then, of course, you get bunker mentality. I'm not coming out, you feel safe in the bunker. And there is something called a barrage hangover. So a load of shells are fired at the enemy, and the enemy gets suppressed by those shells, and then the barrage stops. So do they immediately pop up fresh as daisies, or is there this barrage hangover? Are they now sluggish and delayed in their reactions and less likely to fight? Do they have a barrage hangover? Now, in World War One, what you got was something called the race to the parapet. So you have a load of guys here who've been shelled for some while, and they're deep in their bunker, And you've got a load of guys here in their trenches who have been ordered to attack as soon as the barrage lifts. So the barrage lifts, these guys start running across no man's land. They've got quite a bit of distance to cover, and they've got maybe shell holes and barbed wire and all the rest of it as well. These guys have got a much shorter distance to the parapet, but are they going to just set off immediately? Because when the barrage stops, are they convinced it stopped? Is this just a lull? Is it going to start again any moment? And how are they psychologically? Are they fresh as daisies? No, probably not. They've just been shelled for ages. And they have some problems of their own. They may find that they have to dig their way out, for instance, of their bunker because the trench might have collapsed near the entrance. So and then they've got to get into the trench, and then they've got to go along the trench and find their place and set up the machine guns and clean all the mud and all the damage off them. There's a delay. And so that was the race to the parapet, and whoever got to the parapet first tended to win. So in World War One, that was the decider of a lot of fights on the classic Western Front trenches, no man's land, and all the rest of it. Now, what does a sane man do? Well, immediately a sane man goes, the barrage is lifted, we must man the guns, and he hastens to the guns. But how sane is he? How willing is he to fight? Well, more calculations were done, and it was found that if you fired one artillery shell of presumably medium size, it does make a difference what the size of the shell is, one or two every minute, and it lands within about 200 yards of a soldier, then that'll keep him in cover. He won't venture out. But to stop him firing back is quite important. So to suppress him so much that he doesn't actually head up and fire accurately back, you need 6 shells every minute landing within about 200 yards. Now, if you want to cause the enemy's resolve to collapse, the step up, so it's 1 or 2 to get them in cover, 6 to get them to stop shooting, but it's a vast amount of ordnance you need then to cause them to cause their resolve to collapse. Meanwhile, can I contrast this with figures from military exercises, modern military exercises, where troops don't even go to ground unless they've taken 10 to 20% casualties. Whereas it was discovered, we were reminded again in the Falklands, but just one burst of machine gun fire, and even if they're elite troops like Paras, everybody hits the deck. When there are actual hurty bits of lead flying about, people get much less brave than they do on military exercises. So military exercises, unfortunately, really just don't model reality terribly well. Now, in 1945, when the British attacked the German village of Bauchen, it's 1945. Let's just think of what that means for a moment. By the time 1945 comes around, the British have been going forwards every single day since the Normandy landings, and the Germans have been retreating every single day, and it's obvious to the British going forwards that the war's over now. So, whereas when you were on the Normandy beaches on D-Day itself, it seemed worth taking a risk to save the lives of the fellows around you and to make sure that this operation succeeds, because if this operation fails, oh my goodness, the stakes, the number of people who are going to die, it really is worth fighting on D-Day. But by the time 1945 comes around, and it's pretty obvious the Germans really have lost now, nobody wants to die. I mean, I'm not saying that people on D-Day wanted to die, but they weren't willing to take risks anymore because the war's almost over. The Germans have it's just a few days now. Surely they're going to be throwing in the towel. No one wants to be the last guy to die. Meanwhile, of course, by this time the Allies have got more than a toehold, more than a foothold. They've jumped into Europe and they've landed loads and loads of munitions. They no longer have to be anything like as conserving of ammunition as once was the case. So, even though orders were against this sort of thing, they would expend vast amounts of ordnance to achieve quite modest aims. So, the village was defended by only about 150 men. And they hit it with everything in the kitchen sink. In a 10-minute period, they fired 49 tons of high explosive at it. 49 tons. And I've been told that barrages, they sound like barking dogs. The rhythm of boof, ruff, 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 that sort of weird rhythm that barking dogs have. And so you've got that deafening your ears and just causing terror and causing you to go to ground, and it just goes on. 49 tons. And then they were able to bring up a load of mortars, and another 44 tons of mortar shells rained down on this village. And then they brought up tanks and AA guns, and another 18 tons. 18 tons. Can you imagine that the tanks would have fired off pretty much everything they had and then gone back for more? Another 18 tons of ordnance fired direct into that village. And then, for an encore, a half-hour-long barrage of another 73 tons of ordnance just crashing into that village. So, now in World War One, if you just take the amount of high explosive used and the number of men killed, you get 1 ton per man. It took roughly a ton of high explosive to kill a man in World War One. So this was 184 tons, and there are 150 men there. So it'll kill everyone, right? All dead, must be. I mean, nobody could live through that. So when the Dorset's regiment went in, the infantry, they found no resistance. But only 25 men had been killed in the barrage. Now, that's a lot. That's still 17% losses, but it's an awful lot less than 100%. But those remaining were in no state to offer any resistance at all. Their minds had just been shattered by this. Frankly, even at the time, it was considered overkill. This vast amount of ordnance landing on them had utterly shattered their ability to resist. It was found at that period that if they could kill 3% of the opposition with a barrage, then what followed was almost always classed as an easy victory. But this was, overkill a bit. Now, what stops people fighting back? Well, being dead, obviously. But for every man who cannot offer any resistance after the bombardment because he's dead, 2 are so terrified that they can't offer any resistance. And about 5 are too sensible to try. They haven't completely lost their wits under normal circumstances. Obviously, Balkan was an extreme example. But they are just too... They've done the calculation in their head. It's just not worth it. If the enemy's got this amount of stuff, and then on top of this, we're going to be attacked by infantry, forget it. I'm going to surrender or leave. I'm not going to fight. So even the sane are very likely to be defeated by bombardment. So it's not useless bombarding because the effect is largely psychological. Now, so far, this video has been rather grim, and maybe I should lighten the tone a bit. So I shall. And I shall say it's sponsor time. Yes, it's sponsor time. It is sponsor time. Sponsor time. Yes, it's sponsor time. It's sponsor time. But I thought I'd just give mention of this. It's a ukulele that has been very kindly sent to me by one of my viewers. One Michael Harter from the US of A. Thanks, Mike. It's glossy and it's got inlay and it goes. That was a C. And if some of you are thinking, well, frankly, I wasn't impressed by that ukulele bit of playing there. I think if he's going to try to show off, oh, I can play the ukulele, then maybe he ought to get a bit better than that. Well, in my defense, this arrived about 2 hours ago, and I've watched one 5-minute video on how to play the ukulele. First, how to tune it. It's got really weird tuning. I'm used to pianos and guitars and so forth, where, well, the idea where each string is higher than the one before it, but this one starts high, then goes low, then goes a little bit higher, and then almost just a little bit higher than the first one. High, low, medium, slightly higher, which confuses the heck out of me. Anyway, possibly this will feature in future videos, and maybe I can motivate myself to learn to play it by saying that I'm not allowed to use it in a future video unless I've learned a new chord or, I don't know, something new. Anyway, thanks, Mike. Now then, oh yes, sponsor time, that was it. And this is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Great Courses Plus, let me tell you, it's a huge reserve of human knowledge, expert human knowledge as well, professors and so forth from distinguished universities, and they have people from the National Geographic and the Smithsonian and you know, august bodies such as those. And there are, last time I looked, over 11,000 lectures available, and so, you know, with that number you really can't come up with the excuse, there's nothing I'm interested in. There'll be something, and you get, if you go to www.greatcourses.com, thegreatcoursesplus.com/LindyBeige, access to a free trial, 1 month of unlimited access to as much of it as you like. And if you like it, then you can pay a subscription, then you will have a continuing unlimited access and to all that knowledge. And remember, there are no exams. That's one of the great things. There will be no exams. You might think, oh, more school. But no exams at the end of it. So it's just knowledge, and knowledge is good. So you can go to the URL that I've just given you, or it's much easier if you just click the link in the description. Always easier. Do that. It's at the top of the description. Should find it quite easily. New stuff is being added monthly. Oh, and news for people in the UK and Australia. It is now optimized. In the past, some people had reported that they were having a little bit of trouble paying, but now it should be smooth and easy. Optimized, in fact. And optimized sounds terribly good. I mean, it's a bit like the word optimal. Now, I, of course, wanted something to do with artillery because, or bombardment or whatever, and I typed those words in, and you know what it's like. You go into the rabbit hole, and anyway, I ended up on a course about do-it-yourself engineering, in which I saw a very enthusiastic professor who was clearly very pleased with these very nice wooden models that he'd made of an onager and a ballista and a trebuchet. The arms of the trebuchet were about that long. And being a professor, there are 2 lectures on the making of these. Being a professor, of course, you've got equations and graphs and so forth for optimizing your bits of artillery and the like. So if you are interested in, admittedly it's not modern artillery, it's ancient artillery. Hey, but it's artillery, and you're watching a video about artillery, so you might be interested in ancient artillery, and it's making stuff which I happen to quite like. So that's a do-it-yourself engineering, which is one of the many, many lectures that you can gain access to on the Great Courses Plus, my generous sponsor. Thank you. Now, back to, I've got to get back to the grimness now, the grimness of artillery. You see, artillery really is horrible. I mean, it's sharp shards of metal being flung left, right and centre. It's incredibly loud noises. It's terror. It's something to be avoided if you can, but it's also extremely effective. It's an effective stick, if you like, but it's always good to have a carrot as well. And the carrot of surrender or escape, those are good carrots. Maybe, rather than trying to kill everyone with more and more effective artillery, which is the way that a lot of the modern military seems to be going, maybe we should be using tactical psychology to improve our techniques, and you could call those techniques a form of technology, I suppose, in getting people to do what we want to do, which is to surrender, or at least run away. I mean, run away is good, but surrender is even better because then they don't get to fight another day. Now, if you want to sell a piece of kit to a general today, if you can prove it's phenomenally accurate and deadly, then whoa, that's a great bit of kit. I want one of those. Oh, this drone that drops this amazing missile that can go down a chimney and so forth. Yeah, that's great. And they're really good for killing people. And the British Army today, and certainly the American Army, and I dare say quite a few other armies like them, have become really amazingly good at killing people, but not necessarily good at winning wars. In Afghanistan, was that easy? I mean, we had loads of troops with much better kit, and we're up against ill-led, ill-coordinated, ill-equipped, ramshackle forces, and yet did the Allies win? Did the coalition win? Did the Americans and British win? I don't think many people would